the rivalry that has emerged, some would say since the 1880s, certainly since the 1920s, between our two national movements, have again and again driven Palestinian leaders, and I'm certainly not going to tar all Palestinians with the same brush, but it has driven Palestinian leaders, key elements in Palestinian society, to take positions and to seek alliances, to seek the imprint or the intervention or the help of external forces which would deliver for them. And this is why I think this perspective, this discussion, is relevant to the mission and the work of ISGAP as regards the challenge of anti-Semitism in its modern form. They have sought strategies, so to speak, that would rid them of these bothersome Jews, that would rid them of the national movement of the Jewish people, namely Zionism, in a way which will actually take off their shoulder the burden of actually having to come to terms with the idea that the Jews too are a people, and the Jews too deserve to have the right of self-determination. I don't know if you've seen the news today. In addition to the very murky response from the Palestinian Authority to Vice President Biden's attempt to get them to denounce the kind of the murder that occurred the day before, which took the life of an American visitor, and an act that elements from his own side, not just Hamas, were taking pride for doing. In addition to this murky response, there was also once again this statement coming from Abbas himself, from President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen by his nom de guerre, saying, we will never recognize that Israel is a Jewish state. Or in other words, we will never recognize that the Jewish people are entitled to self-determination. Israel may exist as an accident of history, but we will not recognize the legitimacy of the historical set of events that brought about the emergence of Israel as the embodiment of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And this is a fundamental problem with the Palestinian position. We are not, and let me begin with this final point and then work backwards. The reason Israel today, and this is not just a caprice by the present prime minister, although some people like to portray it in that light. This is something which a lot of thinking Israelis from the right or center-right, the far right couldn't care less about the Palestinian position because they do not seek an agreement. But the center-right, the center-left have come to the conclusion that we do need this to happen. Not because it's important for Israel that the Palestinians should recognize our right to self-determination. We have realized it with an immense effort and sacrifice, and it is not their approval that will take it away or give it to us. But it is of fundamental importance to the future of the Palestinian people that they should come to recognize that they have been fighting a legitimate national movement and not a bunch of interlopers. Because my main problem with the BDS movement, whether it's in this campus or anywhere else on earth, is not that they insult us with terms like apartheid or colonialism. It is that they feed a Palestinian fantasy, which I will describe here in its historical context, a Palestinian fantasy about a world in which the Zionist movement, the Jewish people as a people, will just not be there anymore, in much the same fashion as apartheid is no longer there and colonialism is practically gone. So when they use these terms, in addition to the ridiculous insult, because anyone who's been to Israel would know how removed from apartheid our realities are, the underlying subtext is you're transients, you're interlopers. You will be gone, as apartheid was gone and as colonialism was gone. So when they hold on to that position, and when they are being supported, assisted, and morally pushed forward almost by people in the West, adherents to the BDS movement, some of them may be Jews, for all we know, and that does happen, who think they are doing the Palestinian people a favor. They are doing them a catastrophic disfavor. They are selling them on a fantasy. They are selling them on a hallucinogenic drug which says there's a future without Israel, there's a future without Jews. Ultimately, that is an anti-Semitic position, even if it can be wrapped up as just merely anti-Zionist and decorated with the names of misguided Jews. Because if the Jews of all the people in the world are to be denied, are the ones to be denied the right of self-determination, and of course the actual act of this denial will be followed by the denial of the Jewish people's right to defend itself, and then the next thing, we are on level with the Yazidis. And you know what happens then, right? We saw very clear, when I watched what was happening to the Yazidis, my first reaction was, there but for the grace of the good Lord and the IDF go we. So if we are to be denied our right to self-determination and our right to self-defense, we shall end up at the edge of extermination. So anyone who supports these propositions ultimately brings his or her position very much to the edge and across the edge of active, exterminatory anti-Semitism in terms of the consequences of what would follow if their logic is implemented all the way through. Now, the point is that this temptation to seek a world in which the Jews can be done away with, the Zionist the national project of the Jewish people can be done away with, is not new to Palestinians. And I'm quite deliberately omitting the definite article. There were other Palestinians all along. There are other Palestinians now. But unfortunately, the key elements, the dominant players, again and again, not only actively sought a future of that kind, they realized, and you can understand why they realized, that the Zionist movement, the Jewish people turning into a modern nation, realizing its rights, are sufficiently significant, sufficiently powerful, to carry this through unless they can mobilize the support of external forces. And right from an early stage, we have seen the temptation to mobilize such external forces in support of an exterminatory, or let's call it an eliminatory position, in which you eliminate Zionism and eliminate the Jewish right to self-determination, that they can mobilize, they were hoping to mobilize external forces in support of that position. And I call this lecture the three totalitarian temptations, because at the end of the day, it is only totalitarian promises that can offer a future without a Jewish people and the Jewish people's right to self-determination. The West could never really deliver on an eliminatory or an exterminatory position as long as the West, by which I mean Western democracies, not Germany, as I'll say immediately. But the traditional democracies, like the Britain at its peak of power in the 20th century, the United States after World War II, would never actually deliver on such a fantasy. So quite instinctively, Palestinian leaders, have turned to the totalitarian challenges of the existing order in the hope that woven into this challenge will be the acceptance of a vision of a world without Zionism. And the first such totalitarian temptation came, quite frankly and bluntly, with Adolf Hitler. And this now needs to be set straight because there was let's say, a turbulence created by what I will frankly admit was a misstatement by Prime Minister Netanyahu on what exactly was the nature of the relationship between the Palestinian leadership of the 1920s, 30s, and going into the 40s, and Adolf Hitler. So let me put this straight. Hitler needed no prodding in the business of the elimination, the extermination of the Jewish people. Will remind you that a few months before World War II actually broke out, he spoke at the Reichstag saying, if war comes, if international Jewry brings about another war like it did in World War I, that's the Nazi interpretation of history, then the outcome will be the Vernichtung, the destruction, the extermination of the European, international Jewry and European Jewry. So he didn't need to wait for his meeting with Haj Amin al-Husseini in November 41 to come to such ideas. However, and so let's put that aside. However, it should be said that Haj Amin al-Husseini, having escaped from British-controlled Palestine in 1937, after instigating what we call the events of 1936-1939, the violent slaughter of Jews all over the country, and the British called the Arab Rebellion, and the some Palestinians called the Great Revolution of 1936 to 1939. Having escaped, he did, at a very early stage, latch on to the promise offered by the rise of a Nazi alternative to British power. He was instrumental in instigating the Iraqi rebellion against British power in 1940, the overthrow of the pro-British Iraqi government, the coup of Rashid Ali al-Qailani, and which was followed, mind you, by the slaughter of the Jews of Baghdad, known as the Farhud. And then, with the help of Iran at the time, which was trying to play a neutral game, and through the land of Turkey, he ended up first in Italy, in a conversation with Mussolini, and then in Berlin. And in Berlin, the leader, we are talking not about a marginal figure. People who are familiar with Indian history know that one of the leaders of Congress, who tried to challenge Gandhi, but was rejected and became a marginal figure, Chandra Bose, actually defected to the Nazi side and the Japanese side during World War II. And so, and so there are, you could say these are, and actually they met. Haj Amir Husseini and Chandra Bose met in Berlin. But Bose was not the leader of the Indian national movement. Gandhi was. Haj Amin al-Husseini was the leader of the Palestinian people in the 20s, 30s, and in exile, and coming back, took command of the Palestinian people in 46, 47, and led them to the war of 48, which they called a catastrophe. But you cannot understand that catastrophe if you don't bear in mind that they were led by a Nazi collaborator. And that in many ways the war of 48, we call it our war of independence, was, in a sense, the last battle of World War II. So he comes to Berlin and becomes, I would say, a promoter, a planner, and ultimately a perpetrator in the Holocaust, in the sense that, first of all, he is, as I said, a promoter. In his conversations, his regular conversations with the Nazi leadership, he constantly seeks to make sure that they do not let too many Jews escape or leave, and that they continue to stoke the fires of the extermination. He met Hitler only once, but he was in regular touch, almost, I wouldn't say daily, but in regular touch with Heinrich Himmler. All this is well documented. Moreover, he had a radio station, Radio Zaysen, with a relay station in Italy, in the heel of Italy, in Bari. And I saw the huge wad of translations into English by the British Secret Service in the British files when I was working on my PhD. This is the first time I actually came across some of these stories. For some mysterious reason, even in Israel, we failed to tell ourselves the basics of our own history. So definitely a propagandist and a promoter of an exterminatory position towards the Jewish people. Now, if you think this is past history, I challenge you to Google, forgive me, Alexander, but that's a verb nowadays, to Google the Hamas Covenant. There's a Yale translation, Avalon Project. Don't rely on Israelis. Just go to an academic source. And read Article 22 of the Hamas Covenant. This is written in 1988, and it is still the governing document of the party, the political force, which governs Gaza today. Read this. Article 22 of the Hamas Covenant is a modern-day rendition of the Nazi interpretation of history. I'm not saying this to insult, I'm saying this to inform. Just compare notes between the interpretation of history offered by Radio Bari, Radio Zaysen, the Mufti's propaganda in Arabic in the 30s, and people have done this, particularly Professor Herf, and the language of the Hamas Covenant, chapter 22, which deals with modern history. It's all a Jewish conspiracy. It was the French Revolution. Brilliant of Herzl to plan the French Revolution 100 years before he was born. It is the Russian Revolution. All these international institutions, the League of Nations, the United Nations. We've done well with the United Nations, right? I mean, it really turned out right for the Jewish people. And so on and so forth. it was all a Jewish conspiracy, maybe with the help of the Rotarians and the Freemasons. I mean, this is a Nazi document. This is a Nazi interpretation of history. No more and no less. World War I was instigated, and World War II was instigated by Jewish bankers. You know this as it crawls, you know, even in today's text in all sorts of places. So when European leaders, when the current leader of the British Labour Party treats Hamas as a legitimate force, he is signing on to a body governed by a document which is essentially no different than the Nazi propaganda of the 1930s and early and the war period. Now, Haj Amin al-Husseini did not settle just for propaganda. I said planner because his men joined up with Einsatzgruppe D, led by this guy Rauf, who also engineered the use of trucks for poisoning people, and was later sent to Tunisia to deal with the Jews of Tunisia. If you think that only Ashkenazi Jews in Europe were exterminated by the Nazi war machine, then there is a small, luckily, but harrowing story in North Africa as well. And in between, he sat with a staff of what would be the operational group, planning the extermination of the Jews of the land of Israel, of Palestine. So he was in Athens waiting for Rommel and his army to smash through the British defenses of Egypt, envelop the Jewish community and destroy it in Palestine. Luckily, in El Alamein, November 42, Montgomery won the battle. The fortunes of the war turned, as Churchill called it. This was not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. And he never got there. But the whole idea was to send a few Germans. The rest would have been locals. And I remind you, in some of the most efficient extermination camps in Eastern Europe, there were barely a dozen Germans running the whole place. The rest were local workers, Poles, Latvians, whatever. So much the same would have been the case had Haj Amin al-Husseini and his men been able to work with the Nazi exterminators in the Yishuv, in the pre-war Jewish community. But luckily, that did not happen. However, and when I say perpetrator, not only planner, he did have his day in 1944 when he was sent by Hitler to mobilize the Muslims of the Balkans, specifically the Muslim communities of Bosnia, the Sanjak, Albanians, if possible. Mostly didn't. The Albanians didn't go for this. To the Muslim divisions of the SS, the Hanja division and two others that emerged later. Hanja means a scimitar. That division was actively involved in the deportation and destruction of Hungarian Jewry in the rush effort to destroy all of Hungarian Jewry in the late month of 44 after the turbulence in Budapest. And we don't tell ourselves these stories. I ask Israelis at high places, I mean, National Defense College, how many of you know which country actually first served, then withdrew, unfortunately, under Arab pressure, but originally served an indictment on Haj Amin al-Husseini for war crimes? And not a man in 100 normally knows the answer to that, which is, as you may surmise from what I've just said, Tito's Yugoslavia. So this, and it is not just a story about the Mufti. commander of the Palestinian forces in the War of 48, General Kaukji, or commander of Jaish al-Inqadh, the Army of Salvation, which also was involved in the invasion and the attempt to destroy the newborn Jewish state, was also a commander under Hitler. So on the Palestinian side, going into 48, at the high levels of political leadership and military command, there were people who came directly from the experience of working with the Nazi war machine. Well, that didn't work. And of course, by 48, there were no Nazis left to latch onto. But down the road, from the 1960s onwards, and after a period in which the Palestinians were sidelined by the Arab states, and the leadership in the effort to do away with Israel was taken by, above all, Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, and his agenda, which overshadowed the Palestinian national efforts and all other Arabs in the region. Until 1967, he was the dominant man. He was the cornerstone of their hopes and aspirations and expectations. And therefore, there's little room for discussion about that temptation until after 67. At which point, two things happened. First of all, the Arab armies, particularly Egypt's army, were so thoroughly defeated, humiliated, and broken that their role in providing the Palestinians with a vision without Israel became very marginal. If Egypt was to fight, and it did fight again in the war of attrition and in the war of 73, it was no longer fighting for the Palestinians. It was fighting to retrieve Sinai and come to terms. And so the Palestinians were on their own, and we saw the quick rise of one leader, actually a distant relative from a branch of the same family as Haj Amin al-Husseini, namely Yasser Arafat, to the position of leadership, and once again searching, looking for an external force that could possibly promise them a future without Israel, without the Jewish people as such. And the second, and this tied in or fit in with something that happened simultaneously, which is that the Soviet Union, having been for many years ambivalent, let's say, about Israel and the Zionist project, originally supportive. Remember that in 1947 the Soviet Union not only supported the petition, but actually spoke eloquently. Gromyko rose in the United Nations to speak eloquently about the rights of the Jewish people and the implications of the Holocaust. You can read stuff from Soviet newspapers in 1948, and you would be scratching your heads, in amazement that these are the Soviets that we later face, because at the time they were talking about how the brave Jewish people is fighting the British, dogs of war, the running dogs of British imperialism in the Middle East. Soon enough, however, Ben-Gurion made a choice, and his choice was with the West, with the democracies. It was very clear to him from day one that we would be on the side of the United States, or even Britain. Perfidious Albion would still be on their side in the Cold War, because Israel was a democracy, and because the Jewish people in America had a voice, and the Jewish people in the Soviet Union was in jail. And so much to the dismay of Stalin, who later took it out on the Jewish people, and had he not died in 1953, may have proceeded to the extermination of the Jewish people in the Soviet Union. And if you want some evidence, just read, if you have the stamina, Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. There's a line there. It's an amazing novel. It tells you a lot about antisemitism in the Soviet state, even at the time of World War II. But there's a line there that says Stalin won Stalingrad and went on to destroy Hitler and save the Jewish people, only to come to the verge of exterminating the Jewish people 10 years later. Stalingrad was won in 1942, early 1943, and by the time of his death, he was already killing the Jewish intellectual leadership, remember? The doctors' trials and so on. Everyone who was in the Yev sector, in the Jewish section of the party, was being destroyed. And soon enough, the whole Jewish people would have followed had he not died on the 5th of March, 1953. But still, the Soviet Union remained ambivalent in its position on Israel. It kept diplomatic relations. There was recognition offered to the State of Israel until after 1967. Because in 1967 and following 1967, something amazing happened. Jewish people in the Soviet Union were so elated by this almost incomprehensible victory of Israel, not only Russian Jews, American Jews as well. But they were so lifted by this, by witnessing this, that this generated a renaissance of Jewish identity and a demand for the right to immigrate to Israel, with something which destroyed the Soviet fantasy about the new Soviet man who is no longer Jewish or Kazakh or Armenian or Russian or Ukrainian, and would be melded into this new Soviet identity. This broke down. And so the very existence of the Zionist project became a threat to the core concept of the Soviet state. And soon enough, we began to see ugly anti-Semitic and violent anti-Zionist positions increasingly taken by the Brezhnev regime throughout its years in power. And so the Soviet Union was now the second totalitarian temptation that the Palestinians could latch onto, looking towards a future in which there will be, and I'm quoting from the Palestinian National Covenant now, not the Hamas Covenant, but the PLO secular nationalist covenant, a future without الرجعية الصهيونية والرجعية والاستعمار. Zionism, reaction, that's to say the pro-Western Arab regimes, the monarchies and other pro-Western elements in the Arab world, and imperialism. In other words, the victory of the Palestinian people and the hopes for the elimination of Israel as a state and as a Zionist project were tied to a story that people could still believe, at least until the early 80s, of the victory of the progressive camp. I don't mean progressive in the American sense. I mean, this is how the Soviets referred to themselves in Soviet propaganda. The victory of the progressive camp and the overthrow of America, the overthrow of Israel, the overthrow of the existing order. So here, once again, was a fantasy for the Palestinians to latch onto. So now no longer in terms of race and the Nazi language, but wrapped up in all the refinery of Soviet lingo but this was much the same story at the end of the day. The Soviets would vanquish the West. Remember Khrushchev, we shall bury you. And when they will bury the West, the Palestinians will bury us. Didn't work. Not only were Soviet allies defeated, Egypt defected to the West as a result of Israeli military success. Let's not forget, the greatest achievement of the West in the great game of taking and losing countries in the third world, quote unquote, during the Cold War, the greatest defection to the West, rather than the other way around, was achieved through the force of arms of Israel. Because Egypt otherwise would have stayed a Soviet client. So the Soviets ultimately did not deliver either, and then they turned on their back and died. At one point, when I was still in military intelligence in charge of the Soviet situation, we started calling it the UFFR, the Union of Fewer and Fewer Republics. And so where will they go now? So one possibility outlined in the Oslo process, outlined in the Madrid conference before that, outlined in the minds of Israelis, Americans, hopeful people who thought, okay, now we've come to the point that Zev Jabotinsky once envisioned. The Iron Wall has been built. There is no force in the world that will deliver for the Palestinians this fantasy of our elimination. They will come to terms. Practical terms, generous terms. We will be generous. They will fit in. We've come to that point. This was the implicit hope of the early 90s. What we did not reckon with, somebody read too much Fukuyama, we did not reckon with was the fact that history has not ended. And that there is a new totalitarian proposition rising, this time not from outside the Arab and Muslim world, but from within it. Namely, modern Islamist totalitarianism. Now, I'm just saying this as an aside, and of course I'm keeping my nose entirely out of American politics. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not talking about Islam as a religion or about Muslims. I think it is not only untrue, but extremely unwise to take a position that does not clearly distinguish between Islam as a civilization, Muslims as human beings, and this modern totalitarian version, or to be precise, perversion of religion, which is sometimes referred to as Islamic fundamentalism, but that's a fundamental mistake, because they have very little to do with the fundamentals of Islamic religion and much to do with the template of modern totalitarianism coated in religious garb. One brave Egyptian once called it a shumuliya التي تتمسخ بالدين, totalitarianism masquerading as religion. But this totalitarianism, exemplified today by the Iranian state under Ali Khamenei, its unelected supreme leader, Rahbar, guide. You know where the term guide comes from when it comes to politics, not from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. You go and we'll follow. It's literally a translation from the German. Führer means a guide in German. The whole idea is to denude the people from the possibility of choice going right or left. There's one path, and that path should be taken. This is the case in Iran today. All these election maneuvers and parliament and president have very little to do with real decisions in the Iranian state, which remain in the hands of the supreme leader, who must be obeyed. The notion which is central to Iran today is the notion of velayat faqih, obedience to the lawgiver. The lawgiver being the supreme, another term for the supreme leader, is also referred to as the imam and so on. This is Khomeini's perversion of the Shia tradition into modern totalitarianism. So this new totalitarianism, whether it is in the shape and form of the Iranian challenge, or in the shape and form of the Muslim Brotherhood system, which also essentially copied Mussolini and Hitler. If you read the writings of Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, the founders of Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. More recently, we are seeing the rise of IS under Baghdadi, again, a man claiming total allegiance, given that he claims to himself, as far-fetched as this claim may be, the title of Khalifa, of the Prophet's replacement on earth, literally speaking. Caliph, in the English mispronunciation of the term. So all of these totalitarian variants once again offer Palestinian leaders, young Palestinians who go on the web and read all this virulent stuff and latch onto it and go out and stab people or try to ram them down in a car or whatever. This is offering them once again a fantasy of an alternative. And until we show them that we will stand our ground and we will not be swayed, by the way, neither right, nor need to do stupid, violent things unnecessarily, nor submit to their will, politically speaking, until they realize that this is entirely futile, this will not end. But side by side with it, we also have this another alternative, which is the fantasy promoted by the BDS movement and its supporters, which says we will mobilize the world, the progressive camp in the international community, and we will deliver for you a world without Israel the way we delivered South Africa without apartheid, quote unquote. And as I said, and I think I'll stop here, this is precisely the same kind of poison, once again, that has led the Palestinians from catastrophe to catastrophe. And when we go out and argue against that position, as we should, as ISGAP does, our point must be not that we plead a special case for ourselves. We argue for a better future for both peoples, and that future can only be realized if these false fantasy alternatives are finally put to rest. And if you need a quote from high authority, read the language of President Obama, not, the American evangelical right. President Barack Obama, I'm always tempted to say, listen to President Barack Hussein Obama talking about the Jewish people coming back to its ancestral homeland. His language, not mine. Speaking at Yad Vashem, offering quite consciously a corrective to his mistake in Cairo, which made Israel just the child of the Holocaust. That's not the case. And saying out loud, Israel is there to stay. Israel is not going anywhere. There is no future without Israel. And the sooner the Palestinian people come to terms with it, the better for them, for us, for stability in our region, and for peace in the world. Thank you. How do we take back in the struggle against the idea of Islamism, totalitarian Islamism, that promises a world without Jews? How do we fight it? I would assume in its own turf, within the world of Islam. And I think it's a challenge of the first order. I have many friends, Muslim friends, who are involved in this kind of struggle. I would refer you to institutions, for example, such as the Quillam Institute in London and others who are engaged in this kind of effort. The main point is this, that Islamism is not Islam, and that it is not a return to the fundamental values of the Muslim tradition, but in fact incorporates very large elements of a modern, alien, European totalitarian tradition borrowed either from the fascist model or from the Bolshevik Soviet model, and to argue this from within. But at the end of the day, I'm going to say something quite blunt. Since they have made the battlefield the place where their ideas will be tested, then the likes of IS and the likes of Iran and the likes of the Muslim Brotherhood ultimately cannot be defeated by putting forward a powerful theological counter-argument. It's important, but it's not enough. They need to fail in the battlefield. And that's the challenge of the future. And then people whom I admire, Muslims who have spoken out against these phenomena, will have their chance. I am proud to think, for example, of Imam Chalgoumi, the Imam of Drancy in France, one of the leaders of the French Muslim community, who was a guest in Israel during the fighting in November 12. I am proud to think of him as a friend. There is an alternative to Islamism. This is why it's so important that, as I said, American politics aside, that we do not tar all Muslims with the same brush. I urge everyone to read very carefully the challenge that President Sisi of Egypt threw to the ulama, the teachers and intellectual leaders of Islam in Al-Azhar University last year, telling them we can no longer sustain an interpretation of Islam that makes the name of Islam dirt in the eyes of much of the world. It's a very powerful speech. It's a remarkably courageous speech. And we need to offer such ideas every support possible. Well, historians are not prophets. I don't want to speculate as to whether this is what we are seeing now, which is very dramatic, will last for years or decades, but I think that allow me to deconstruct two terms that you use. The Arab Spring is by now more or less the mother of all misnomers. I mean, this has nothing to do with the birds, the bees, the flowers, or the seasons. This is, if you wish, a catastrophic earthquake. Something, if you have to use forces of nature, everything that we've known is broken into pieces. Countries have disappeared, regimes have vanished. There have been upwards of 400,000 people slaughtered in Syria. That's not spring. And I'm beginning to doubt whether there is a Middle East. The term Middle East lumps together. It's first of all a British frame of reference which says the center of the universe is London. And according to distance from London, you have a Near East, Middle East, Far East, and once upon a time they used to call Japan and Korea the extreme East. let's get rid of this taxonomy. I mean, London, with all due respect, is a wonderful place, but it's not necessarily the center of the universe. Nobody in China will concede that they are far from anything. And as far as I'm concerned, it also lumps together the North African situation, which has its own dynamics, the Gulf, which could be a different planet. I've been there, and I came back with a sense that while in Tunisia I felt at home, in Doha I could have been on one of those Star Wars scenes. I mean, it's a very different world. What did happen, and the reason I'm saying this is that I believe that Israel's proper definition in terms of our geopolitical placement is that we are an important Eastern Mediterranean power. And today it's not just the Arab world, but also Greece and Cyprus, for example, and others in the Eastern Mediterranean strategic environment that are beginning to pull together with us, both pull and pull together with us against the forces of Islamism and their supporters. So it's Israel, Cyprus, Greece. It's Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. It's Israel and Jordan, quietly. It's Israel and Egypt, quietly. Italy is coming in as a player. The Adriatic coast nations, the northern tier in the Balkans, for their own reason, the Bulgarians, the Romanians look at the rise of Turkish Islamist politics and they say, let's build a capacity to balance or contain this. These are profound developments. So if you're asking me, do I think that the new alignment that brings Israel, Egypt, Jordan, in the background there are the Gulf, pro-Egyptian Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as distinct from the pro-Hamas, pro-Muslim Brotherhood state like Qatar. Is this alignment a short-term thing or a long-term thing? I think it is going to be part of the landscape as long as Erdogan on one hand and the Iranians on the other remain committed to Islamist politics, and so we all have to stand together to stop them from realizing it. So for a while, I would say. What will happen in Iran? We've been perhaps given a period of time. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Because right now, while they have been more or less obedient to the terms of the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal, which is not a deal because it's not an agreement, because had it been an agreement or a treaty, the president would have needed 67 senators when he didn't even have 50. But this arrangement, this plan of action is currently being obeyed. But parallel to this, the Iranians continue with very dangerous activities across the region. They have enslaved Lebanon to the point in which Saudi Arabia is disowning the state of Lebanon because of the level of Iranian influence there. They are involved in Assad's destruction of his own people. They are involved in Yemen. Just the other day, the Australian Navy, God bless them, stopped an Iranian shipment of arms to the Houthi uprising in Yemen. And they are active subversively across the region. And in addition, they have just launched 2 of their ballistic missiles against the explicit position of the United Nations Security Council. On the tip of one of them, they actually wrote, Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth. If that's not anti-Semitism, I don't know what is. And the level of tolerance towards this Iranian position by the signatories to the JCPOA raises very serious questions.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.